Hi Group 1, my name is Adelaide Anser, and I'll be connecting our reading The Social Construction of Ideas and Knowledge from Neiman to explore how Canadian media frames homelessness in our major cities. We will be looking at how recent news coverage in Vancouver and Toronto reflects the liberal ideology of individual responsibility and reinforces the myth of objectivity in mass communications. In other words, the way that we talk about homelessness in Canada is not neutral, it's shaped by our ideology. Some key concepts from Module 5 I'm going to be talking about now. So in this chapter, Neiman argues that our ideas, values, and beliefs are socially constructed. Neiman defines ideology of a system of beliefs and values that shape how we see the world, often without realizing it. These different ideologies are enforced through socialization, especially by mass media and educational institutions, which teach us what is normal, acceptable, or morally right from a young age, and what values to have and to not have. Neiman explains that liberalism is the dominant ideology in capitalist societies. It emphasizes individual freedom and responsibility. Due to this, we learn to view social problems like homelessness, poverty, and addictions as personal failings rather than structural issues. Finally, Neiman challenges the myth of objectivity, which is the idea that mass media and education can never be truly neutral. In reality, people with economic and political power, like owners of large media corporations, can influence what information is produced and how it's presented. Before we look at the news stories, it helps to understand how framing works. A study by Calder and colleagues titled Framing Homelessness for the Canadian Public, the News, Media, and Homelessness found that Canadian news outlets tend to use episodic frames, which are stories focused on individuals, their actions, or specific incidences, rather than thematic frames, which highlight broader structural causes when referencing homelessness in the news. This framing encourages audiences to see homelessness as the result of individual failure, things like addictions, mental illness, or bad choices, rather than policy or economic inequality. So in other words, the media is reflecting the liberal ideology of personal responsibility, while coverage of structural causes like housing policy or income inequality is limited. I've put a link to the paper down below where the questions are, as well as links to the news articles that I'm going to be talking about next. I also just found a little stat that I think was interesting to talk about in this paper. There was an 80 to 20 difference between how homelessness frames are presented in media. So they found that 80% of news stories focused on homelessness are told through an episodic frame, while 20% are told through a thematic frame focusing on systematic and structural causes leading to homelessness. So the first news is from Global News Toronto. It's titled City Clears Encampment from Toronto Park for Second Time. This focuses on city vehicles removing tents and belongings. It uses phrases like, "These tents are not permitted to remain." Trespassing includes quotes that the city offered hotel rooms and they made every effort possible to assist those living in the encampment. And while this does sound balanced, it frames homelessness from an individual lens, promoting the idea that these people refuse to accept help instead of addressing why shelters may be inadequate in the first place or why people are homeless and what has led to this. The next article is from Global News Vancouver, and it's titled Vancouver Spent More Than $400,000 to Clean Up Sanctioned Homeless Encampment. Centers on cost, cleanup, and logistics, treating homelessness as a financial and management issue. It mentions housing support as secondary to the narrative of cleaning up, and uses a lot of neutral tones like cleanup, debris removal, maintenance, which are just facts. What's missing is why those people were there in the first place. This relates to the myth of objectivity, demonstrating that news cannot be unbiased because it's always going to be told from a certain perspective, even when words sound neutral. So now connecting homelessness to Neiman's ideology, or to ideology in action. When we read and listen to news stories about homelessness, a few ideological patterns emerge. First, we see the liberal ideology, the idea that homelessness results from personal failure rather than structural inequality, which I've mentioned many times over this video. Second, we see the myth of objectivity, where neutral language like cleanup or maintenance hides moral judgments, making the government action seem necessary and reasonable instead of asking why people are unhoused. It also aligns with Neiman's point that mass media serves the interests of those with political and economic power. It acts as an agent of socialization, teaching us what's normal, like the idea that cleaning up encampments all the time is necessary, instead of asking why these encampments exist at all. Why is the homelessness increasing so rapidly, especially in Vancouver and Toronto? This avoids challenging the current capitalist system that even creates inequality in the first place, and when media is owned by powerful people and the owning class, they don't want us to challenge the capitalist system. Liberalism and the myth of objectivity work together to make inequality appear natural and inevitable. Public learns to see homelessness not as a result of capitalism or failing housing policy, but the reflection of personal weakness. For discussion questions this week, the first one is, when media describes encampment removals using neutral terms like cleanup or trespassing, what kind of ideological assumptions or values do you think are hidden in that language? For the second one, how might coverage and public understanding change if news outlets focus more on structural causes of homelessness, such as housing policy or the high cost of living? Thank you, guys.